All right. Thank you for being here. Geek podcaster Kurt Sasso from Two Geeks Talking. What is different about your podcast setup from when you started to now?
Hmm. Well, since I started in 2008, which is way back when on the internet, especially in the minds of everyone out there, technology wise, I was only doing an audio only podcast. So the quality of audio in 2008 was, to be blunt, brutal. It was 64 hertz of audio. It was very tinny, very shallow. It was as if you were talking through like a tin can, through a string to another tin can. It was very poor quality overall. So when I started, it was just a call-in show. So I was just using TalkShoe as my host of my podcast, and their quality was horrible. I think you got 96 hertz if no one was on their servers. So we had we got lucky a couple of times where the quality was just okay. Since then, 2012, I upgraded to doing a video interview as well as a podcast. So I started using web cameras like the wonderfully legacy version of the Logitech C920, which is still good to this day. If you can find one cheap, grab it. I've had no issues with her. And then the speed of the internet, the accessibility, the mobility of where you can listen to your podcast on your mobile devices. You don't have to be attached to, say, iTunes. You can listen to any of the 16 other podcast platforms. So I think accessibility, better technology, faster internet speeds have been a wonderful attribute to getting this show heard and seen in many more locations.
How did you decide the format for your show?
The format for the show, it got, you get the typical back before the phrase "I want let's make a podcast" became popular in the past 10 years. Back then, it was like, we should make a podcast. Uh, what are we going to do? There was no terminology like, oh, niching down or anything like that. It's like, what did you want to talk about? And so, because I was working with a friend of mine on webcomics.com, he had a database actually of over like 4,000 plus webcomic creators or online comic creators. And so I said, hey, we have access to all these people. We should just really, interview these people and set up a platform and get them showcased on a different avenue, because being a sole creative person, you are, beholden to your own promotion. So let's make a podcast. Let's get these guests on the show, and let's have a conversation, just informal, conversational. Just have a good time talking back and forth about why they wanted to become artists, what their comic was about. Get a little advertising or promotion for some maybe read-in sponsors, and just have some fun. I think that's what it was, because reading web comics is what got me into um, be doing this show, and as well as meeting so many amazing, talented people that are now working for like Marvel and DC. So 2 hour conversations, 3 hour conversations on poor audio quality, live call-in show as well too. So we had people calling in that wanted to ask the guests questions, or just chat in general, and it kind of took off from there. It's been a wonderful ride. I almost want to go back to the live format, because I kind of missed that chaos.
What is that the big difference between live and recorded then, is just the chaos part of it, or can you like explain that a little better? Because
Yeah.
I've done all recorded.
Well, a live show. So when I say live show, I'm not talking like streaming live. That's something
Oh,
I'll
okay.
touch on briefly. But a live show is when it's like a radio show, but only in a podcast format. So you would have like an 877 number or 800 number or whatever it was, and while you were streaming live, while you were doing your show live on the air that people could actively listen to, like a streaming service like iTunes or whatever, they could actually call into that 800 number, and you just activate their microphone. They would ask the question, you thank them for their question, and then you'd answer it, or you'd have a conversation with them. So it's like a precursor to, it was after what radio had already established. So it was kind of like a nice segue into the digital world of live call-in shows. So if you had a popular show, or if you had a popular guest on and you promoted it well enough back then and said, "Hey, call this number now. We're live, and you can ask this guest the question," they would call in, and you'd hear the little beep in your ear, and that would actually trigger on the show itself. It would say call incoming or something like that. So it
Hmm.
could be distracting if a guest is talking, and that would appear. But that was just a fun experience, and it really got some early on community engagement and communication engagement for the show itself, which kind of gave it a little popularity boost, where it's like, oh, hey, there's a show we can call in live and do this. um, but yeah, I record everything locally myself. I record everything through Zoom or through. I think I'll go back to StreamYard one of these days. It's been a long time since I've been back there, and I have tried like a YouTube live stream where I've just gone live and just had a conversation for, say, my anniversary episodes. I think that's always a fun experience to have. You just go through the chat and you know say hello to the people that stop by, whoever they are, if they were past guests or not. So it's all about trying different ways to reach an audience that you may already have access to, or you may not have access to, and you're reaching them for the first time.
Yeah, I've been using StreamYard for about a year, and I like it better than Zoom.
Mm.
And I've looked at some other ones. I think you just got to find the one that you like the features of and
Yeah.
then learn it, because that's the big thing, is learning the features of whatever particular one you're using.
Yeah.
But StreamYard is simple enough that I can handle it alone without much issue. And then doing the clips and things are all built into it. And that's nice.
Yeah, no, that is something that I've had to do a little more manual these days. I provide a service for guests if they want to be clients of the show, and I'll take their full hour or 45-minute interview, and I'll cut it down into my 30 seconds to a minute clips, just because I like the physicality. I know there's programs out there that can do it, but it just doesn't quite have that same level that I was looking for. So I like adding my own B rolls and things like that to the shorts, and it's fun. It just keeps you creative and active. I like it.
Nice. Yeah, that's another level of podcasting that I haven't gotten into, of the we were talking about before we started recording, of like watching your levels and doing all the audio stuff of it. That's StreamYard keeps it pretty simple. And I've had a few where I didn't realize it would switch off of the regular microphone to like the laptop microphone. And it does sound different.
Oh, yeah.
And after you, and when I have it the way I have it set up, I can't tell if that's happening unless I just get that feeling inside, like something says, you should check your microphone, and then I can go in and check it while I'm talking and confirm or whatever. But it's I like the simplicity of it, but I can see the whole other level of diving deeper into it and really, if you will, geeking out on podcast tech. And then I've talked to other people that record locally, and I've done that a few times with StreamYard when I started using it. And it was just, you'd have to keep the person on so long after to download their local recording, that I was like, oh, this is not what people are going to want to do. But it's where people take the local recordings and then they run it through a filter, and then they like clean up the sound, and then you have to match it back up with the video. And I was like, oh, geez, if I had to do all that, I don't think I would do all that. This wouldn't be happening. So I do like the ease of a program that can do all that. And
Yeah.
StreamYard is that clips now, where you can do shorts like up to 20 minutes
Oh.
and then clips up to 1 minute.
Oh, wow.
And that makes it really convenient. I haven't used Adobe and all the other ones before, like clipping it out.
Right.
So this is my only experience with it, but it's been pretty easy to use.
Yeah, it's another level of engagement, like you mentioned. Shorts just hit differently for, if you get that 1 minute segment or that 1 minute hit of wisdom or inspiration or whatever from a great guest, then throwing that up as a lead into their actual interview is a great way to kind of get eyes back towards your show. And that's what I've been trying to do a little more often as well too. But for me, like, because I'm recording video and audio together, I don't have to worry about syncing or doing anything like that. And then when I'm done my final edit, all I have to do is extract the audio as well, just separately, and I just upload that to my Podbean server and post it on a Monday. And the interviews I do for video post on a Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, and away we go. It's just there's so many ways to reach an audience or to communicate with an audience, but the problem is keep getting their retention, keeping them coming back. Like, how do you do that is always still feels like it's always up in the air.
Yeah. Yeah. I like when I first started, I had a few clips that were over a minute. And then I discovered the one that goes under a minute, and I felt like hemmed in by it. But then you get used to it. And when you're talking, you can put a marker in to say, this is something that I think is a good little clip. And then you come back later and it's easy to do. I was doing 6 clips per show to start, and now I'm doing 2, which is easier. But it's I do find myself trying to get around that 30-second mark or less.
Okay.
If you can just get that one little idea in there, and then that's what I use on Instagram or X or YouTube clips and things. So I don't know the secret to marketing as far as algorithms go. Like, sometimes your show gets picked up and you see thousands of views, and then other times it's like 2 or 3, and you're like, man, come on. Is it just me, the person I talked to, and their mom that watched this? Or is it my mom that's watching it? So I don't know, that seems like you could also get lost in trying to figure all that stuff out too. And from the people I talked to, I haven't heard a really good answer about it yet.
Well, it just comes back to, you can get down a rabbit hole of the statistics side of things and the analytics, and that can really kind of just dampen your mood and your creativity when it comes to just, do I really want to speak to another person that only gets me 10 views? Well, if they provide value, I don't think views should matter. It matters about their content on the long scale, on the long haul, where, maybe a year from now, that same episode that did horribly in the first week is going to hit something different, or hit an audience that wants to hear that advice or wants to hear that guest, or something's changed in the algorithm where they've decided to loosen their tightened restrictions on your views, and they said, oh, we'll give this video a shot and go from there. But it's all a game, it's all a long haul, and it's just a pain sometimes when you put so much effort into not only interviewing a guest and researching them, but to have like a computer say, nah, this isn't what the internet needs to see these days, when you feel like it does. But
yeah, that's a bummer way to put it. I mean, I feel that, I understand it. I'll take the tens of views though. I mean, tens of people will see this show. It's what keeps you going then when you've been podcasting for so long. Have you had the time where you just go, what am I doing?
Spite and revenge. No.
Nice. It's good. From a Canadian, I wouldn't expect that. Okay.
Well, you haven't read our history in World War I or II, have you?
Why would anybody read Canadian history?
About World War I?
Oh, burn.
I don't know. You might have to go back to your White House and see if the paint is still dry, for the 2 times we burned it down. But
oh, burn. That's shots fired. I don't remember learning much about Canadian history in school growing up, and I think it's because they wanted to kind of gloss over after the Revolutionary War, and then America's like, why don't we take Canada? And then it didn't work out, and they're like, okay, but let's just stay down here then. So I think that's why they keep it out of the curriculum a little down here. But
understandable. But I think if you go down a rabbit hole of a Wikipedia article search or a TikTok search on Canadian history in World War I, there's a reason why they've extended the Geneva Convention documentation in regards to warfare. Wow. Yeah.
Well, it's war.
Yeah, it's true.
Give me 15 minutes and then check Wikipedia.
Fair enough. But no, it's just interesting to see, who you can get on the show. Like I'm sure for you doing this show, meeting different people every day, or whenever you schedule is always interesting, and you get a different viewpoint from all over the world. I think that's always wonderful to see, and I enjoy it. I mean, unless there are repeat guests on the show, everyone is new to me based on either what I've researched or how we've conversed, and it's just something different. I mean, when you interview a doctor that's a comic creator in the Philippines while a typhoon is going on there, kind of
Mm.
puts things into perspective for, how good an audio quality of a show you need to have.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the talking to strange people is probably my drive for it, and why it started
Okay.
is like, whether go to writing groups, which is one of the reasons I go to writing groups, is to meet strange people, because they're that's where they collect. But it's then, like, trying to figure out creativity and what it is and what it means to other people
Mm.
is interesting to think about. Even if nobody is watching,
Yeah.
it's still interesting. So I think that's why I've gotten to the point where I look at it and go, I don't know how long I'll do a podcast, but as long as I'm learning more about creativity, that's good enough for me. And then you just have to find the right spot for how much you can do and still live your life, but still have this as part of it, like where it fits in.
Yeah.
How'd you figure that out?
Well, I think I'm always still figuring it out. You do something for 15 years, it becomes habit. But
Mm.
if you do it for 15 years and it's still enjoyable, then it's a hobby or profession. I can't recall. It's that old adage of you work a
Mm.
day in your life, whatever that phrasing is.
You got to finish that off like Biden would, where you just go, you know,
Yeah,
you know
yeah,
what I'm
yeah,
saying.
yeah,
You know
exactly.
what I'm saying. Come on, man.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a common phrase. Everyone knows it.
You
Anyhow,
work, if you do something you love, you
yes,
never work a
work a
day
day
in
in
your
your life.
life,
Yeah,
something
you
like
got
that. All right.
it.
Fool me once, shame
Yeah.
on whom, strategery.
That's good. That should have been an SNL sketch.
Yeah.
The I think for me, it just comes back to I still enjoy it. I still keep doing it. The question now becomes, how long will I do it? Like, will I do 20 years? I got 4 to go, basically. So we'll see what happens. But I think as long as there are creative people in the entertainment industry that want to promote themselves, that want to talk about themselves, that are engaging and entertaining in some way, whether they have a dry sense of humor or whether they're serious about wanting to become a professional and they feel like they're an indie creator. I want to chat with them. I want to see what makes them tick, and you switch up your questions every couple of years. For me, I've been going more introspective for a documentary that I've been trying to put together for the past 12 years, and it just comes back to wanting to make the best episode you possibly can, and just make sure that your platform is open and available to those that are that want to promote themselves. And I think that's the hardest part about being a creative person is, how do we create and how do we promote to remain living with our creativity?
Hmm.
It's not everything that we do. A podcast isn't a hobby. A podcast is a profession. Being a podcast host is not just interviewing people. It's the social media managing, it's the editing, it's the other hats that we have to wear to put together a show like this. And people just think that podcasting is a hobby, when in reality it can be a business if you set up that model for it.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, no doubt, that do it. I'm not sure the recent stats on how many shows a podcast usually gets into, but it is very, like, this is just that tip of the iceberg. When you actually look at a podcast, that's all the work behind that is a lot more than I thought. I like that because you're learning all these different things, and then you can see those different pathways. It's like I often go to the scene in the Matrix where it's raining and she opens the door and Neo's going to get out and she's like, you know where that road goes. And I mean, I don't know where the road goes specifically, but when you look at, like, do you want to get into the technical side of sound? You look down a road like that and you're like, ooh, I could do that. Do you want to get in the technical side of splitting your sound from your video? How about different cameras? How about all the, and you're like, oof, there's a lot of different things you could specialize in or spend your time to work your mind on. And I like that. It's kind of like sailing, where it's not just, there's always something to move around, and you could trim that sail, do that a little different. So that's the fun part of it, but it's also the exhausting part. And then you just have to, see how much of it you want to do and then figure out how much you can do.
Yeah.
It,
And
it
graphic
is a profession.
design. I mean, there's so much that
Mm.
you can do. It is, even if you focus on one aspect, even if you focus on audio and video production alone, and that's not even setting up your cameras, or not, that's not even setting up your frames, or the editing side of things takes hours and hours to deal with. And don't get me started on, oh, an AI can do this quicker. No, not really. Like, if you're a true professional at your job, you're scrubbing through that audio, you're cutting your points, you're making sure that your guest sounds way better than they are during the actual recording. At least I do. I make sure that I cut out all the ums and the ahs, and that may be overkill, but I'm thinking my video is going to go out there, it's going to be clean, but the audio I have for that is going to be listened to forever, basically. So, let's make the cleanest version possible that people will enjoy listening to without being taken away from filler words.
I like your attitude and commitment to perfection. I do not do that, because I leave things like that in. But it's maybe one day I'll get to that point. I don't know. I'm still early in that path. You're way far ahead. So maybe it's, you just get to the point where you're like, well, I can now work on these things and make this better and move that thing and do this.
Yeah, I'm not really rearranging things. It's just more of a, I ask the question, I get the answer, but sometimes the guest will trail off, or they'll go onto a different tangent. And while it's still good, can that be used elsewhere possibly, or does that just fit their train of thought? Like, I try to keep the train flowing. Perfection, not any stretch of the imagination. I'm not a perfectionist. It's just, how does this sound? Does this hit the right beats? Is this the complete train of thought? And does it reinforce the point that the guest is trying to make? That's kind of my 5-point framework that I go by.
What do you do preparing for each show?
I think, besides the usual social media scourge of their platforms, whatever they're using, it depends on what they are in the industry. If they're a comic creator, you have to look at their online work on their social media posts, Instagram, X, whatever. Maybe they have their own website. Maybe they are posting on a daily basis. Then I start looking at that. Or maybe they're a PDF only digital copy that you have to either get a review copy of or whatever. And this is for either indie or professionals in the big 2 or 3 industries. When it comes to, say, television and film, is it something that I've seen before? Is it something I can quickly do a YouTube search and figure out what shows they've been on to have an intelligent conversation? Then when it comes to music, just listen to what they have, what they do. I mean, I interviewed Biff Naked. That was a cool experience, and had a nice quick half-hour conversation, but that led to me interviewing a guitar photographer named Lisa S. Johnson, who's photographed over 1,000 guitars of the rock era, from Elvis's guitar all the way up to Kurt Cobain and others. And we're not talking like wide photography. We're talking like macro photography. We're talking like seeing the grains and the details and the wear and tear of these amazing guitars that have played throughout our history and in our lives that we've enjoyed. But one interview can lead to another, can lead to a connection. Like, hey, you should really go on this show. And as long as you make that good first impression, and it comes back to the research side of things, then be as thorough as you possibly can. I mean, we all can't be Sean Evans on The Hot Ones, where we have a team finding everything, or we can't be like Nardwar, however he gets his information. I'm still baffled at over the past 40 years of his career. So we all find ways to fill in those gaps for the guests that we have on the show. And maybe a random question that you have on your list of 300 makes it into the interview, and it's something they haven't been asked before, and that sparks a whole other conversation. So being flexible, it also helps too.
Yeah. Jason Momoa has that
Mm.
on I can't remember the name of the show, where he does the art stuff. And when I first saw like the first episode of it, I was like, oh, this is just going to be like a redo of the Jason Reedus ride show. And then watching the Momoa show, you're like, wow, this guy, he's into the art. And you see the excitement he has about it, and you're like, wow, it's a good show. I recommend it. And he has a couple guitar shows too. But
Nice.
it makes me think about the macro guitar stuff where you're getting in there, seeing the wear and tear on them. That's interesting.
Yeah,
So then, do you have, when you started, did you like prepare questions for each show, or questions for a topic, or just a bank of questions? How'd you do that?
well, I think so. When I first started, I had a co-host with me. He and I always say that I'm an introverted extrovert. So I it took me 5 years to become an kind of an extroverted person. I can turn it on when I need to, like for
Yep.
something like this. But for the most part, I'm an introverted person. I do with that information as you will. So when I first started the show, my main co-host was actually the kind of the lead. He was like kind of the primary host, and I was giving like the color commentary side of things. So I would just kind of hop in every so often, and I would either ask a question or I would, make a joke and would continue the conversation. So it was very open format. There was no real set. Here's the question. Here's the answer. We would ask the question of, so where we can find you, why did you like this comic, or why did you want to create this comic series? Who are your main characters? What's your release schedule? Things like that. Very basic, very bare bones, etc. And the rest of the time, it was the people would call in and they would ask their questions if they knew the guest or whatever, or the guest would be talkative enough that it would fill in the 2+ hours that we had during the early portion of Two Geeks Talking, because we were doing 2+ hour live shows constantly, and we did that for 3 years straight. And that's a lot, and that's not edited either. That was just, you press record, you release it, here you go, warts and all. As the show evolved, as the show got to video as well, it just came back to, I need to be a little more structured. I need to have a little more control on what the guest wants to talk about, only in the sense that I need to start editing down, because no one's going to listen to 2+ hour interviews. They still, 15 years later, will not listen to 2+ hour interviews. In fact, you'll be lucky if they listen to even 15 minutes or 5 minutes of your own show.
Wow.
So a little more structured, a little more focused. The guests questions that I give, other than my final 4 introspective questions, are questions I've gathered either through searching online, through what are good interview questions for TV or movie actors or actresses or producers. Here's a general list. And then I kind of fine tune it for the guests. And then things I've created and things I've kind of like, conversations I've had with guests. Sometimes a question will trigger and like, okay, well, I can generalize a question just enough to make this universal for anyone, no matter the industry they're in. One example would be, for a comic creator, it would be, what comic do you think people could attribute to your comic that you've created that would make them want to read more? I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically the gist of what comic influence should they see when they read your comic? Like, not your own personal influence of why you created the comic, but if, say, someone's reading a comic and they think, wow, this feels a lot like Sandman, or this feels a lot like, Frank Miller's Batman, Dark Knight Returns, things like that. Is that a subconscious reference to the comic you're creating? I mean, I could pull up my list and actually read the actual question if you want, but it just comes back to what question fits the guest. And I try to be unique in at least the base questions I want to ask them, because every creator is different, no matter the industry that they're in. So I'm not going to just use boilerplate here's the traditional questions you're going to get asked 20 times a day in your lifetime for the comics that you're creating. Let's switch it up. Let's be a little different. Let's try to be a little more introspective and educational in the answers that I'm going to get back to, because that'll provide more value in total in the long run for evergreen content than just, how long did it take you to draw a page? Why did you use this color for this character? Things like that.
Yeah, I approach it from the what am I interested in?
Mm.
And I figure that there's going to be other people out there that if they're not interested in everything that I'm interested in, maybe there'll be one or two things that cross over and they're like, oh, yeah, well, that's worth listening to. Disappointing to hear that people are only listening to 15 minutes. But I mean, when you listen to podcasts, do you just listen to that? Like do you listen to any other podcasts?
I don't have time, unfortunately. It's not for lack of trying, but it is. I am usually swamped with either a backlog of interviews I have to edit and get released. I have a contract with a radio station currently for a year. I think I'm like 8 months into it or something like that, where it's an Atlanta-based radio station where I'm have to reformat my interviews to standard radio format, which is 58 minutes. I have a mockumentary series I'm currently working on as a digital imaging technician to copy the footage from 4K, and then I have to transpose it down to 1080p. So I'm kind of in that industry as well. So I'm kind of all over the place from an entertainment perspective, but it's like I don't usually have time because I'd rather listen to music than say a podcast, unless there's something or someone that I'm like absolutely interested in, like say Gary Vaynerchuk or maybe a Tim Ferriss interview or something like that, where I'll just kind of play that in the background. But
yeah, who wouldn't listen to those?
Yeah, people that don't know them. That's about it.
Wow. Well, I wonder, the audience for podcast has to be so varied, though.
Oh, yeah.
It's like I didn't start listening to podcasts probably maybe in, I guess I can remember sometime between 2012 and 2015, maybe before that, or maybe the closer to the 2012 side of it. But like when I listen to podcasts, I listen to a lot of them and I listen to the whole thing, and some of them can be hours long.
Yeah.
And I'll still listen to them. Maybe that talks about how busy I am, but it's maybe when just doing a podcast and not doing all the editing and everything frees up time so I can listen to Joe Rogan.
Hey, there you go. Yeah.
I kind of view it as it's the purpose of the podcast. There can be many, but my view of it is it's more like a conversation between two people, and it would be much different if you were in the same room, but you try to get that feeling as much as possible. That's what I'm going for. And then when I'm listening to podcasts, those are the ones I usually listen to the most, or that is that type of setup, the conversational. And then it's like you're in the room with them, like you're having like you're in the conversation.
Yeah.
You can talk, they're not going to say anything to you, but oftentimes the same thing that you think of, they'll start talking about. So it's just following that. You can tell they're not reading off a list of questions. Although I still have like questions on if I have creativity, like somebody I want to talk to about creativity, then I have 4 or 5 questions about creativity that I just think about.
Yeah.
So then if I don't think about them in the moment, I can look at them and go, oh, okay, this is what I usually think about. I wonder what they think about this.
Nice.
And that works pretty good if you get stuck and you don't know what to talk about. Like you have that pause part and it's being recorded. And I would much prefer having a conversation while eating, but that's going to be weird on video. If the other person's eating, you're eating, and it's strange. But
well,
I think that's what I'm trying to capture with the podcast. I don't know.
But that's a good thing though. And that's how my show started as well. And that's how it continues to be, because while the questions are good to have and they are a very good guide to have, my questions, I started writing questions down when I went to C2E2 in Chicago for a comic convention. Way back when they first started, so 2012, 2013, which was my very first comic convention I'd ever been to. I know, being a geek, that sounds sacrilegious or something like that.
Surprised.
Yeah, well, when money is tight, you do with what you can. So I'd rather pay an internet bill than go to a comic convention.
Makes
Um,
sense.
so I had cue cards. I had, those cooking cards, cue cards that I would write. I looked at the entire guest list of who I wanted to interview, and I wrote down like 5 questions, a cue card. And then during the 4-day event, some point during that time, I put the cue cards down on someone's table and walked away, and I forgot about them. So someone has
Some
an
great
archive
questions.
of the past. Yeah, exactly. They have great questions for
Yeah.
these amazing, talented, creative people I wanted to interview, and I had to learn how to wing it, learn how to freestyle, basically, ask questions of these creative people that either I was a little nervous on, or whatever the case may be. But face to face is a lot different when you have a set amount of time. Like I was doing 15-minute interviews in comic conventions, and time is money at comic conventions. They want to sell their books. They don't want to really do the press side of things too much, unless you already have a built up repertoire with them.
Mhm.
So for me, the following year, I ended up going to Toronto's Fan Expo Canada, which is the third largest comic convention in North America. And I said, okay, I'm going to set myself a limit. I'm going to only ask questions that'll give me 5 minutes of their time, 5 to 7 minutes of their time at most. So that's tight. You have to really hone your questions down, and they may feel generic, but they're going to hit the key points that you want to get on the video and want to get on your interview. And then you can just post it with very little to no editing at all. So that was kind of the goal, and that's kind of worked out very well for me. Sometimes the conversation will go longer if you've known them for a couple of years or whatever. They'll free up more of their time. But if you're getting one of the big names in the industry, whatever industry that is, you're usually locked in at you have maybe 5 to 10 minutes at most with these people, and then hurry up. Like what I did with Jason Mewes. That I spent 15 minutes with him, and his handler was not pleased with me. So
Mm. Hmm. Be weird to have a handler.
manager, handler, same thing.
Yeah. Usually with the questions, I'll read them before, like in that you have that what you do a week before the call or the conversation, what you do the day before, the hour before, the minutes before. And usually within that hour to minutes before, I read the questions on whatever topic I think we'll talk about. And sometimes we talk about them, and sometimes we talk about stuff totally different. So I do find that if you start reading the questions just down the list, then the whole conversation flow goes out, because you're not, oftentimes if you have 4 or 5 questions, instead of reading them in a row, you just start in the conversation. Eventually you'll get to all 5 of them throughout the conversation, because it's things that you're interested in, that you want to know about. So
Yeah.
I think that
Go ahead. Sorry.
I think that matches up with why when you listen to a podcast, you could ask a question, and then eventually it gets asked, even though they didn't hear you. It gets asked because that's just that normal flow of what it would be in a conversation.
But I think you can also use lead-ins for, hey, that reminds me, and kind of fill into your question as well. Or, that's a great point. I think, and you could lead into your own response and then lead into the question, that reminds me of the time when, etc. Um, you can always fill in some way, shape, or form. You can always lead into the question you want to do just by the response to their answer to your previous question. And sometimes that feels more natural than just staring at your screen, staring at the question that's blinking at you in front of your face there that you should be asking. But yeah, the conversational approach is a lost art, or it can be a lost art, where everyone is so used to being, here's the question, here's the response, here's the question, here's the response, and they cut out any of the filler or the banter that maybe there's a joke, or maybe there was some comedy involved in between, that the guests got more relaxed as you were going on with the conversation, where they just felt really nervous in the beginning. There's little tricks and tips that you can get from either other interviewers, or you can get from maybe your own style of speaking if you think of them as a friend. I think that might also give you a little flexibility in the conversation where you're not as nervous and the guest is not as nervous because usually you feel them loosening up after about a half hour for the most part.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like a podcast in the first hour is different than the third hour. You get to get a different feel for it. And apparently nobody else is listening, but maybe that's what makes it better is nobody's listening. When you were co-hosting, how much did y'all talk about what you were going to do or talk about the topic before you started talking to that person?
Because we were dealing with guests specifically and a comic specifically, besides our own personal research in terms of reading their comic, like we would actually read their entire archive, no matter how many thousands or years they had done their comic. So that's how prepared we were, and that could have lasted. One of them spanned over 20 years. Let's put it that way. And we had an interview like a week later or something like that. So a lot of long hours. But in terms of our conversation, my co-host at the time and I had known each other for at least 5 years. So we used to play World of Warcraft together. So we had known our conversational patterns when we're dealing with 40 people in a raid, and a lot of those people I'm friends with to this day. Because so anyone that says gaming doesn't bring people together are idiots. So
Yeah.
it's online friends that are, in my opinion, lifelong friends. So we had known each other's style of conversation and speaking, our own patterns. So it was very easy for us to just have a conversation with another person. It was just like bringing them into the fold and just talking about what they're passionate about. A couple of years later, he had a scare with cancer, and he beat it, which is great. But he had to move on with his life, and I had to make a decision 3 years into the show, saying, "Am I going to keep doing this? What is going to drive me to keep doing this?" And so it's like, well, I want this to be a job. I want this to be a profession. So I'm going to take what I learned with my fellow co-hosts, Phil, and I'm going to put that towards every single guest that I have on the show going forward. And yes, it's going to be uncomfortable for me as an introverted person to talk with people. But if they're passionate about something and I'm passionate about what they're passionate about, hopefully that can be conveyed in our conversation. So the research hasn't really devolved for me. It hasn't lessened. Uh, I'll still read what they're giving to me because I'm not going to go back through an archive. I'm going to read their current project and then maybe touch on, hey, what have you done in the past that, how have you evolved as a creative person from the beginning of your career to what you're now currently making? What got you to that point, et cetera, questions like that. So it's about changing your thought process and your views. And with age and time and experience, you get a little wiser, hopefully.
Yeah, I think if you took that Myers-Briggs personality test now, that you would probably, like, if you're not talking about work, about podcasting, you're probably at like an INFJ. That when you say, well, I'm going to answer it as my work person, then you'd probably be like an XXFJ. I'm not a psychiatrist, but that's my experience with it. Is I was the same way before I got into policing, and then like there's a question on there of you start conversations with people, but I mean, when I'm not at work, I don't start conversations with people. But when I was at work, I started a lot of conversations with people. So you have to answer it in those two different worlds.
Right.
It is strange, the development of personalities over time. Maybe that's another subject. So did you think about doing co-hosting again or bringing in another co-host, or were you just like, it's easier to do it when I'm just working with this one moving part?
I have had co-hosts in the past, and either they're guest appearances or they've been past guests and they wanted to co-host for a certain guest I had on the show. I've had, I think, about 100 or so co-hosts over the past 15 years, just as either a one-time thing or maybe they've co-hosted. I think the longest person I had co-hosting was 7 times in 15 years. He was my more consistent one, but he was a comic creator and a longtime friend. And he actually was a radio guy who got me all set up with my equipment and, my levels and things like that I had no clue on what to do. So we spent an hour on a Skype call or something, and he'd be like, "Okay, tweak this, tweak this, tweak this," and now you sound like an actual radio person. I'm like, oh, "Okay, cool."
Nice.
So, but no, it is easier for me just as a single person because scheduling has become a lot easier with online calendars, direct emails, trying to get guests on through social media, with X and with Instagram, or go to their website and send them an email. Looking at TikTokers that are actually like providing interesting comedy sketches and approaching them. Just trying to find new and different guests to bring on the show, and while I can get other people on the show or as co-hosts, it's a time factor. Like, what if I
Yeah.
have a co-host that's from the Philippines? Okay, well, now that's a 6-hour time difference or 12-hour time difference the other way. And yet I'm interviewing a person in, say, England, and that's a 6-hour difference from East Coast alone. How do you schedule that? And it's like, it's just easier with one person these days.
What's your success rate of success, like percentage, I guess, of people that you ask to be on the show that actually end up being on the show?
I haven't done too much actual looking for guests because a lot of times I'm full by January, I'm full into June. So word of mouth has been great over these past 15 years. I'll still toss out the occasional social media post saying, "Hey, just to let you know, I have things that are open in terms of these particular months. I have this service as well if you need something quicker." But for the most part, I'm quite literally just finding guests through word of mouth, and hey, if you've been a guest on the show, who would you recommend to be on the show? Like, I try to do that type of interactions with those types of guests that have been on the show, and that's actually been something that has worked out very well for me in the past.
How often a week do you do recording? Like, do you have days set aside for it?
So the free show is always going to be Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern. If there's a certain guest, say on the West Coast, that's picked a free slot, then I'll change the time for them. But I usually do at least one episode a week for sure, and that usually gets posted whenever my queue opens up. So right now I'm scheduled into, I think, the end of July into August is when my queue is scheduled for posting content. I have 5 I have to edit currently, which is bad because one has to be released in July, and those were long conversations, an hour conversation. Most of the time, though, I can edit it down to about 30 to 40 minutes, so that works out. But in terms of my calendar, paid interviews always take priority in terms of editing and promotion. But yeah, for the most part, I'm booked until at least September right now.
Yeah, my biggest stress of starting was consistency. Like, am I going to be able to have at least one show per week?
Yeah.
If I'm doing a one show, if I'm doing a weekly release, which Wednesdays is when they get released.
Nice.
And then I started with 1, got up to 3 just to see how that was. So did a couple months of 3 shows every Wednesday, and now I'm like at 2. Sometimes I think there'll be 1, but usually another one comes along and I fill it in. But it's like I could comfortably, I think, on my own do 4 a week. That feels like more a job than it does like doing a 4 releases on a Wednesday. And then you have the people that cancel, like, because you book them out so far.
Yeah.
Then I don't know. I haven't done any like analysis of it, but just go by what my feeling is. And I think I get as many cancellations from distant schedules than I do from near ones. And then every now and then you get the person that just doesn't call and doesn't show up. And you're like, oh, geez, this is why I don't do live.
Yeah. No, I am with you 100% on that. I think this year alone, I've had 13 cancellations. out of
Yeah.
however many I'm up to, I think 42 in total. So either you're right. I completely agree 100% with that. Either it is because they booked like 6 months in advance or 3 months in advance and they forget about it. I've had that happen. And then there are other times where, oh, geez, I didn't realize I'm at a convention. Can we reschedule? And then when they
Yeah.
reschedule, they put in the wrong email address, and it's just like, okay, so I just wasted a Saturday for that. Um,
Yeah.
it's tough though. I mean, it's kind of a hit when you don't get people showing up because you're taking the time out of your day, they're taking the time out of their day to be on your show to promote themselves and realistically and have a good conversation and a good time and that can take a hit to the mood. I mean, it's just it's a shame when that happens, but if you can fill it in or if you can then release or at least update yourself so that your schedule is being um, you have a bit of a queue so that you have a little more flexibility in time where you can focus on other things.
Yeah.
That's kind of why I release into as much as I do and only once a week, because then it's like, all right, I have something I can fall back on if something comes up in life where I get too busy to do something. At least I'm covered for my schedule.
Yeah. I try to keep it as close to within a week of talking to the person to when it's published, just because if there's anything like a current event or whatever that we talk about, I'd like it to be somewhat current. But then you think, well, people might watch this years down the road and it's not going to matter. So it is nice to have that cushion of a couple episodes just waiting to go in. But it's I think the lowest I feel doing podcasting is when you prepare for a guest and you're excited about it and then they just don't show up. If somebody cancels in advance, that's not so bad because you haven't put all that final last week's work into it. But when you've read their book or whatever over months, you spread that into your schedule and then you've been looking at all this stuff, you're excited about it, you've had conversations in your head with them already. You try not to do that too much, but like you're excited about it and then they don't show and you're like, man, who am I going to talk to about cyberpunk now that I've done all this looking into it and they canceled or they did. Yeah, the no call no show is the worst, but I'm sure
Yeah,
that's the same with anybody.
yeah, it's especially if you're doing graphics, if you're doing like custom graphics like I do, and you've created the title image and you've gotten their headshot, which it's taken weeks to get their media assets or months for that matter, where you have to constantly remind them. I it gets to the point of why am I actually doing this? Then you realize, okay, well, it's something different visually than anyone else is doing. It's not your traditional, here's a little blip on the bottom of the screen. It's just something like graphically that'll grab their attention. And if you like that type of creativity, graphic design type stuff like I do, then it's just becomes habit and you want to keep it going.
Yeah. Your sixth sense has probably much more developed than my own on when you talk to somebody, if you're like, oh, this isn't going to happen. And I've talked to another podcaster that does like regular weekly shows on a TV station, the Rise and Outshine.
Nice.
Can't remember his name now, but had a good talk with him. And then I can just see he's on that different level of he's thinking of other things.
Mm.
Like I was going to be a judge on one of his shows and I misunderstood. And he was like, no, I'm going to book you as a guest. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. I don't know if I want to be on a game show, be like the call in judge on a game show. And he's like, oh, okay. And he had already sent the invitation and everything.
Mm.
And I felt bad, but I'm glad we caught it right then when we were talking. And then I just know that he's like, I'm going to put this guy, him thinking about me, I'm going to put this guy in the not going to commit side and he moves on with what he needs to because he's got all these deadlines
Right.
happening every week. And I go, oh, okay. I can appreciate that. I understand it. So I guess you develop that sense of when you try to get an email from somebody or getting information from them and it's difficult, then you're probably leaning towards this is a person that's going to cancel or not show up.
Yeah, to a certain extent, it has happened where it's like, all right, I one person that had like 80,000 followers or something on Instagram, does a lot of really great short content. I scheduled him through Matchmaker, I think, or something like that. .fm, which is for hosts and guests. Uh,
Mhm.
and so I was like, okay, I've scheduled him. He goes, how did you find me? I said, through this service. He goes, okay, cool. Let's get this going. Couple of weeks before the actual interview, I was like, okay, just let you know we're still, on this time on this date. He goes, yeah, that's fine. And then no media assets, no nothing. Then he sends me another email saying he may have to reschedule. And then he's like, no, I'm good. And it's just all this back and forth stuff where I was waiting and he never physically showed up. So it's like
Yeah.
I booked my time. But there are other times where it's like, oh, thanks for the reminder. I totally forgot about this. I'm glad you're kept up to date with this. Things like that, like what you did with me. Because honestly, I had a basic calendar item booked in my thing saying it's the HDC interview. I'm like, what is this? I can't remember. It's been for too long. He sent me the email. I'm like, oh, thank God. I'm glad someone was on top of this. So
Yeah. Organization is a
yes,
huge thing, I think. I think that's why a lot of podcasts probably stop, is because
yeah,
people don't realize how big the time and the work is that goes into it. And then the organization, easy to get overwhelmed. If you don't start at the very beginning of, you got to have a spreadsheet of, or some way you account for guests that you talk to,
yeah,
guests that you send an invitation to, so you don't send 3 or 4 to somebody that never responds. And
yeah,
yeah, once your show is done, keep track of that.
yeah.
It's a lot of those little things that you figure out along the way.
Yeah, it's gotten a lot easier though. Like I remember I'd have to open up like Office 97 or something like that for Excel to track all this stuff. Now that there's things like Calendarly and Zoom and whatever else in terms of scheduling, it's just so much easier and nicer because you have all that data you can go back to. You can add them to your own personalized newsletter, or hey, I know we haven't talked in 6 months. I have an opening in this time bracket. Are you available? Things like that. It's like you can get repeat guests that way, and if you've done a good job with it as a host, then they're more than willing to come back on for whatever they want to talk about. So yeah, there's so much flexibility nowadays that it makes things, as a host, it makes things a lot easier, but it's still time consuming no matter what we do.
Yeah. Speaking of time, here's
Mm.
a segue. I know you've got a time constraint working on the mockumentary. I hope that goes well. What is the best way for people to follow you and pick up your podcast, all that?
Well,
At least 15 minutes of it.
if I'm lucky. Uh, the best way to find me, of course, is at twogeekstalking.com, tgtmedia.com, or twogeekstalking.com. Website's going through a complete revamp. So my YouTube channel is always open. It's youtube.com/TGT The podcast can be found at twogeekstalking.podbean.com, or just search Two Geeks Talking wherever you get your podcasts. And as I say every week, everyone has a story to tell. It's up to me to help bring that out. Thanks for listening and watching on Two Geeks Talking, and of course, the Hump Day podcast.
Nice. Well said. We'll leave it at that. I'll talk to you at the end of this musical exit.
Thanks for having me.